Do you know? Do you know what week we are in? Well, some of you will be like, this is the week between November and the beginning of December. Perhaps this could also be the week of the 11th week of the season. Some of you could also say this is the week of Thanksgiving, perhaps the week of the beginning of the Pilgrim's Bounty event in WoW, or maybe even the week where San Jose in California is founded, or perhaps even Albania is liberated during World War II. But actually, this week has an even more important event to commemorate, because what we are commemorating with the beginning of this week is also the reaching of the 50% through the raid buff of this season, meaning Nerobar's Finery this week is now reaching 9%. The Sever Strand buff, which increases at every couple of weeks, now this week has gotten to 9% if you have gotten your at least 16 of these fineries every couple of weeks to turn in the quest, and the maximum value of this buff at this point in about 8 weeks, in a couple of months, will be 18%, so we are now halfway through. So considering this is the first time in these modern raid tiers in WoW where we have been getting this sort of an alternative to very simply nerfing bosses over time as a way to make the raid easier, it begs the question, of course, to ask ourselves if this is a good solution, a good alternative, a good possibility to continue to see happening in the future tiers, raid tiers in the game. And before you answer if you thought this was a good or a bad thing, remember that this raid buff is also contingent not just on the power in the raid, but it's also going to be affecting players who, for example, only care about Mythic Plus. If you thought, I don't care about this because I actually don't really raid, so this is not really that much important for me, actually it still is. Because this raid buff is also regulating the power, the item level power of your character in the season. What do I mean by this? Well, the answer is very simple. If you go back, for example, to Vault of the Incarnates, which, as a good comparison, was the first raid tier of Dragonflight, you can take a look at the progression stats of the last couple of bosses, Razageth and Diurna, and you can check out the average item level of the guilds starting to progress on the boss and then where they were at when they ended the boss. Now, back then, for those who don't remember or simply didn't play, the average item level of players who were farming the raid, players who were crafting items with the max level crest or perhaps getting the max item level from the Great Vault, even from Mythic Plus, the max item level around that time was between 418 to 419 item level. We still had no crests to upgrade our gear, we had no myth tracks, not even hero track whatsoever at the beginning of Dragonflight, meaning that all you were limited to were 415 item level pieces from Mythic Plus, a single 421 item level piece from the Great Vault once a week, half of the raid bosses were dropping 415, and then Korog and Datia were dropping 421s, and Broodkeeper, Diurna, and Razageth were dropping 424. So the average was around 419 item level. The guilds progressing through the last boss, Razageth, started the progression, as you can see here, on average between 417 to 418 item level. And they finished the progression of the boss, which was a pretty, lengthy boss, took you a few weeks to kill. They finished the progression at around 418 to 419 item level. So they practically began and ended the progression around 1 to 2 item levels away from the strongest, most powerful state you could have been in that season. In terms of item level, in terms of character power, you can move one season later into Aberrus. This was the infamous release of the new upgrade system. So the old Valor system goes away. Now we have quests, now we have upgrade tracks. Initially, with this new system, Blizzard had a tiny mistake. The tiny mistake that the first few bosses were capped at this low item level of 441, which was just too low. It became too outdated, even getting passed or matched by Mythic Plus gear. So Blizzard introduced, a few weeks into Season 2, the Myth track for raid gear. This pushed practically all of the gear you found in the raid all the way up to 447 item level. You had a handful of, 450 rare pieces, but for the most part, the top item level you could get in Aberrus was 447. maybe 448 if you had a handful of those rare items. And you see that for the progression of Scale Commander Sarkar, the last boss, the starting item level, the most popular average starting item level back then was around 444 item level, and finished with the kill item level around 445, 446 item level. So it was again about 3 to 1 item level below the 447 item level, which was the strongest you could get back then in terms of gear. Then you move over to a Mirdrasil. This is the more recent one, where all of the gear was equalized. You could upgrade all of the mythic gear up to 489 item level. And you see that, for example, the starting item level on Ferak was 486 to 487, and the ending kill item level of Ferak was again 487 to 488. So it was again 2 to 1 item levels below the cap, below the strongest you could be. Now, in these 3 raid tiers, you had no catch-up mechanisms. You had no stacking raid buff that you could get every couple of weeks. All you could base your power on were these things right here. The hotfixes, the nerfs the bosses would get week after week or every month, every couple of weeks to make the bosses easier. Those where you would find your power-ups as a player, beyond just your gear, which would get to close to max item level very quickly. Now, compare this with where we are now, with Nerubar Palace. In Nerubar Palace and in this season, the max item level, where you can get, is 639. All of the gear, all of the myth gear goes all the way up to 639. Technically even slightly lower, because in this season the crafted gear has been nerfed. The crafted gear stops at 636. So having crafted gear on you slightly weakens your item level, but in general, the top you can get at would be 638 to 639. And you can see that even starting from Silken Cord, since we're talking about a pretty lengthy boss, the starting item level of this boss was 627 item level, which is about 12 item levels below max. And you would finish Silken Cord at around 632 item level, which is still 7 item levels away from the max item level you can get. And then you move over to Ansorek, to Queen Ansorek, and the starting item level was about 632, which is still 7 item levels away from the strongest you could get this season. And the kill item level is around 634 item level, which is still 5 item levels below the max. So compared to the 1 to 2 item levels, 1 to 2 item levels, 1 to 3 item levels of the previous 3 tiers, now the average here is 10 to 5 item levels below max power. That is why I am saying, no, don't just say, well, I don't really care about the stacking raid buff and what effect does it have on the raid, because I don't even raid. I don't even bother raiding. At best, I get my ahead of the curve, I get my crests that way, and then for the most part, I just do Mythic Plus, so it's not really something that affects me. It actually does, because it also would affect the max power level in terms of gear you would get from the season, because without this raid buff, without this stacking raid buff, Blizzard would have either had to A, increase the item level rewards from the season in order for you to get closer to 639 max item level much faster than you have now, so that the bosses would be easier, or B, consistently nerf bosses more and more often in order to bridge the gap from you losing the stacking raid buff and still having this low of an item level compared to the previous seasons. So one of these two things would have to happen if we were to remove this newly added stacking raid buff for damage and healing this season. Obviously, for most, Mythic Plus only players, it would be much more preferable to instead raise the item level power of rewards, for example, like Mythic Plus or the Mythic Plus Great Vault, or making the upgrades with crests cost less, so cost 10 instead of 15, so it makes it easier and faster for you to get higher item level gear. Perhaps bring back the crafted gear to be now again at max item level, so instead of making it stop at 636, bring it back up to 639, etc, because this of course would also empower players who don't Mythic raid, as opposed to the alternative of very simply nerfing bosses more often. That's where we have the question again about how did we feel about this stacking raid buff in the raid this season. I feel like the overall amount of nerfs and massive changes in the way the bosses worked went quite well this season. You know, we're not looking at some kind of nightmare similar to Sepulcher. Yeah, if you want to know just how often the bosses had to be nerfed, starting from Anduin, even Alondrus, you had to add multiple hotfix patches week after week, nerfing bosses multiple times to make them more easily killable. This season, we haven't really gotten to that level. We have gotten one major nerf of Queen Ansurek a couple of weeks ago. We have gotten one nerf to Silken Court like over a month ago. And then much of the other nerfs happened quite early on, when, for example, Brood Twister and Nexus Princess were being killed by literally like 5 guilds or 10 guilds. We're still talking about the first 2 weeks or 2 to 3 weeks of the race to world first. So nerfs that were really affecting like 10 guilds, 15 guilds maybe. For the remainder of the guilds progressing on Nexus Princess, for example, the 900 plus guilds who killed it, about 800, 830, 840 of them did not really get too impacted by the initial much harder version of Nexus Princess. Same would go for Silken Court and for Ansurek. So I feel like the sets of the stacking buffs given every couple of weeks, 2.5% more damage and healing every couple of weeks, has been a pretty good addition to the easing of the difficulty in the raid, while also not affecting other activities like Mythic Plus or even PvP, because this buff is only limited within the raid. So overall, it has been a pretty successful addition. As far as the newly introduced raid buff to help you with easing the difficulty of the raid every couple of weeks, with this buff stacking and now reaching the halfway mark, we are at now 9%. So in a couple of months, which will also be likely towards the very end of the season, before getting into a new raid, it will go up to 18% more damage and healing. I thought overall it was a pretty good addition to the raid for smoothing the difficulty. I think it was pretty nicely implemented in this first season. We will see how Blizzard feels about this as we get into the next season, and whether or not we will continue down this path of having this stacking raid help growing throughout the season when it comes to the raid. But for today, on this Friday, this was what we were pointing out as we reached the halfway through lifespan of this raid buff. And with this out of the way, all that's left is of course leaving you to the rest of your Friday, according to some historians, the beginning of the weekend. Now, with these things out of the way, we can now leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone who is supporting Competi for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I'm not too much of a fan of dry cold. I'm cool when it's cold but the sun is out, and I'm also cool when it's cold but it's raining, so it's not that cold.